FIGU Bulletin 48. Readers question again and again. Concerned parents reach FIGU with the request to take a position on the increasing drug problems. In particular, the widespread trivialization of the so-called soft drugs and the legalization of hashish, marijuana, cannabis, etc., which is targeted in many countries, give occasion for serious concerns. The fact that the consumption of hard drugs may trigger severe health damages as well as psychological and consciousness-related damages is generally known. What's the effect when so-called soft drugs are consumed? Elizabeth Gruber, Austria M. Summer Matter, Switzerland. Answer: the topic of hashish is very extensive and fills many reference books, which is why it can only be dealt with in a very condensed form. Hashish is not as harmless in its effect as its advocates suppose and maintain, for it is a narcotic that gradually causes permanent damages to the psyche and consciousness and also causes permanent impairments to the nerves. Unfortunately, very many human beings are ignorant in reference to this fact, and in particular, extremely naive politicians want to enforce a liberalization of this intoxicating drug, often because they themselves have become addicted to intoxicating drugs. The prolonged use of hashish leads to impairments of the nerves and of the consciousness, to indifference, listlessness, irresponsibility, psychological disorders, behavioral disorders, personality change, intellectual and emotional confusion, as well as to anxiety, depression, and the inability to live. Of course, all these forms of appearance are vehemently contended by those who are psychically dependent on hashish, which also carries over to the irresponsible politicians who want to advocate and liberalize the enjoyment of hashish. A denial of the harmfulness of hashish is also made by science, which, for a long time, unfortunately, still won't have progressed so far that it recognizes the real danger and the actual long-term effects of the enjoyment of hashish. All cannabis products in the form of intoxicating drugs do not represent a euphoria and a means for the uplifting of the general well-being, for in fact, such a state of euphoria is only based in a form of fantasy, which gradually and imperceptibly leads to delusion and isn't recognized as such. And whether the experience of the state of euphoria from hashish is positive or negative depends solely on the world of thoughts and feelings, on the state of the psyche, on the personality, the mentality, and the character, as well as on the momentary mood of the person who enjoys the hashish. Also, the surroundings and the behavior of the people present play a large role. If personal problems or a depressed mood exist, then this still amplifies and worsens everything, which then leads to the so-called horror trip, a state of unstoppably racing, terrible fear visions, from which one affected by it can hardly escape anymore, and this may even drive him into a confusion of consciousness and psychological confusion. Cannabis products are not a means of escape from reality, for in fact, they can amplify this very much. An escape from reality is achieved with alcohol or hard drugs, or while human beings are religious or sectarian. Hashish is not an aphrodisiac, a means for stimulating the sex drive. But since it generally intensifies sensual perception, there's the possibility that it influences a sexual experience very positively in one case or another. This comes about, then, because the main effect of hashish is that the momentary experience and mood are intensified very much. Hashish also produces, like other narcotics, a flashback, a so-called echo intoxication, which can still appear several days after the enjoyment of the drug. Also associated with this are motor, nervous, and consciousness-related appearances of damage, whereby abnormally increased, so-called déjà vu experiences appear. An environment suddenly being perceived as unreal, foreign, and strange is also one of these manifestations. Then, in the course of time, everything can increase to tangible symptoms and panic reactions. Due to the higher content of resin and active substances, hashish causes, in the case of inhalational intake, about a 5 to 7 times stronger intoxication compared to marijuana. Characteristic of hashish intoxication are a temporary pulse increase induced by a slight, central stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, as well as a continuous reduction in body temperature lasting up to 24 hours. A dry feeling in the neck and throat, and psychomotor disturbances, especially the so-called hashish catalepsy or pseudocatalepsy, as well as trembling, midrisis, and occasionally also an increased feeling of thirst and hunger also appear. In psychological regard, hashish leads to an intoxication that lasts for 2 to 3 or even 4 hours. At the same time, there arises a loss of the sense of time, in terms of a substantial slowdown of the subjective passage of time, this in contrast to the effect of alcohol. In regards to this, it comes to a tolerance formation, where it concerns an effect of a direct influence on the brain functions. Additionally, it comes to a general decrease of spontaneity, of the drive, and of the caring interest in the whole environment, and to be sure, up to lethargy. One withdraws from an active intervention in the course of events in the way that one only lets himself have an influence on himself. A human being intoxicated by hashish withdraws into himself and falls victim to purely associative, seemingly profound contemplations and contemplations of fleeting ideas, as well as to his own altered perceptions. In addition to the changes in experiences of time, it comes to apparently more intense sensations, where these are less pronounced in relation to the experiences of time. Such sensations especially arise with respect to spatial perception and in the auditory as well as optical area. These impressions manifest themselves, for example, in the stronger and contrast-richer perception of colors, whereby non-concrete patterns appear when the eyes are closed. A higher dosage can lead to hallucinations, which are mostly pseudo-hallucinatory. In the course of these, the critical judgment of reality remains, whereby the human being under the intoxication drug keeps away from the effects of intoxication and experiences the hallucinations as unreal. In the case of a higher dosage, psychological effects appear, whereby the boundaries between one's own personality and one's surrounding reality, which arises as a result of one's early childhood learning, are blurred, which is designated as a so-called body image disturbance. This can lead to disturbances of self-identity or to depersonalization, which isn't serious at first but, nevertheless, yields its long-term consequences. The psychomotor disturbances are evident in the expressive behavior, like in one's gestures, facial expressions, and movements. In the intoxication state, the thought process of a human being is disturbed, but this isn't perceived by the one intoxicated because he or she contradictorily considers his or her own thinking as particularly original and precise, which is, of course, a profound deception that, nevertheless, isn't accepted as true by the one intoxicated. In fact, one's thinking loses its inner coherency, which also refers to one's feelings. Here, temporal continuity and continuity given from one's mind are also lost. Integrating partial aspects of complex events into a meaningful whole is no longer successful because the thoughts wander about aimlessly and even break off and cannot be resumed, through which no connection to thoughts which have gone forth can be made anymore. This process traces back to the fact that one's ability to concentrate diminishes and gives way to a lack of control. The entire thought process in its fragmentary character is very reminiscent of a splitting of the consciousness or of schizophrenic contents of experience. At a higher dosage, all thinking during the hashish intoxication becomes immediately visually perceptible, while all sensual and concurrent inhibitions, which are detached from acquired patterns of perception and their interpretation, diminish, and the intensity increases. This leads the intoxicated human being to the erroneous view that it concerns an expansion of his consciousness and so-called evidence experiences, but this is truly a gross self-deception, which takes the place of unsuccessful rational insights. If the blissful feeling of connectedness with the environment, which is associated with the intoxication, is considered, then the whole thing is reminiscent of a religious and sectarian enlightenment in the sense of a unio mystica or mystical unions as well as ecstatic visions. Hashish is a product that is extracted from the family of the hemp plants Cannabis sativa elva indica. The plant and the substance extracted from it are toxic plus as well as irritating to the skin and allergenic. The actual homelands of the hemp plant are India and Persia, Iran. In the past, hemp was also cultivated in fields in Europe, primarily for the extraction of fibers for fabrics, cords, and ropes. Hemp products were also used as food, beer, corn ointments, and as homeopathic remedies for painful bladder cramps, etc. In the gardens, hemp was primarily cultivated as a rapidly growing ornamental plant. The female plant grows to a height of up to 4 meters. Today, one reads and hears again and again that hashish users cultivate the hemp plants in rooms and that profit-hungry and work-shy hashish cultivators grow the plants on a huge scale in greenhouses. The unauthorized cultivation of hemp and the trading of hemp products, which are effective for producing intoxication, are forbidden, of course. Concerning the ingredients and the poisonous effect, the following is to be said: the active ingredients, the so-called cannabinoids, produce intoxication. The amount of these substances and the intoxicating effect are dependent on the solar irradiation. As a rule, hemp that is cultivated here in Europe only has a weak effect, due to the low active substance content. In the illegal market, the narcotic is generally offered in 2 forms. Flowers of the female plants and dried leaves are called marijuana. Their enjoyment occurs through smoking, like with tobacco. The dried resin works much more intensively. This is extracted from the glandular hairs of the tips of the flowers and is called hashish. Hashish is either smoked in a pure form in a pipe or mixed with tobacco as a cigarette, a so-called joint. As an effect of intoxication, there arises a feeling of well-being as well as a peculiar feeling of floating, combined with intense experiences of music and color as well as tangible processes and images, but these depend on the state of consciousness, the mentality, the ability to imagine, the world of thoughts, and the character, etc. of the person who uses the narcotic. The narcotic produces rather unpleasant side effects, which can be varied. So, for example, states of anxiety and drops in blood pressure can occur just as well as a tendency to collapse and depressions. With hashish, no bodily or physical dependence appears, but longer enjoyment leads to an extremely intense psychological dependence. With hashish, there's always the risk that heroin becomes secretly added to the drug by the irresponsible distributors, which isn't perceived, of course, by the hashish users. Thus, they quickly fall into heroin addiction and switch over to this intoxicating substance, completely in accordance with the slogan "Heroin holds what hashish promises." Hashish also isn't harmless in reference to its poison. Therefore, in the case of too much enjoyment, hashish poisonings can also appear. In the case of a mild poisoning, a 10-gram coal suspension can have a calming effect, but in the case of a greater intake of poison, a clinical treatment must be urgently announced. The hemp plants also directly irritate the skin. The end.